The twisted metal screamed against asphalt as Conrad Miller slammed on his brakes, his construction truck skidding to a halt just inches from the overturned sedan that had careened through the guardrail on Riverside Highway. Steam hissed from the crumpled engine, and through the spider-webbed windshield he could see a figure in white trapped inside, a bride, her wedding dress torn and bloodied, crying out for help in the pre-dawn darkness of Millbrook Valley. What Conrad didn't know as he sprinted toward the wreckage was that he was about to save the life of Isabel Lopez, the missing daughter of Richard Lopez, the billionaire construction mogul who owned Miller Development Corporation, the same company that had been laying Conrad off in 3 days due to budget cuts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony was staggering. In 72 hours, Conrad would be cleaning at his desk, trying to figure out how to explain to his 8-year-old daughter Emma that Daddy had lost another job. He'd spent the last 6 months working double shifts on the Riverside Bridge project, the biggest contract Miller Development had ever landed, hoping his dedication would save his position when the inevitable layoffs came. Instead, he'd received the termination notice the previous Friday, along with 24 other workers whose names meant nothing to corporate executives making decisions from glass towers in downtown Millbrook. Now at 4:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, heading to an emergency repair job that would probably be his last, Conrad found himself face to face with a crisis that had nothing to do with construction deadlines or corporate politics. The sedan had flipped 3 times according to the skid marks, rolling down the embankment before coming to rest against a cluster of oak trees that had likely saved the driver from plunging into Miller Creek below. The impact had caved in the driver's side door, but the passenger side remained accessible, barely. Conrad had been a volunteer firefighter for 12 years before Emma was born, back when he was married to Sarah, and life seemed like a series of manageable challenges rather than an endless string of financial emergencies. The training kicked in automatically as he assessed the situation. Fuel smell meant potential fire. The way the car was positioned meant any shift could send it tumbling into the creek. The bride, Isabel, though he didn't know her name yet, was conscious but trapped, her left leg pinned beneath the dashboard, her wedding dress soaked with blood from a gash on her forehead. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Conrad called out as he approached the passenger window, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I'm going to get you out of there, but I need you to stay as still as possible." Isabel's eyes found his through the broken glass, wide with terror and something else, relief that bordered on desperation. She'd been trapped for what felt like hours, but had probably been only 20 minutes. Watching her phone's battery die as she tried to call for help, knowing that traffic on Riverside Highway was minimal at this hour, most people were still asleep in their beds, unaware that Richard Lopez's daughter, the heiress who'd vanished from her own engagement party 6 months ago, was fighting for her life in a ditch just miles from the family estate. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of settling metal and dripping fluids. "I don't want to die like this." Conrad had heard those words before, in burning buildings and collapsed structures, from people who'd given up hope until someone showed up who refused to let them surrender. He pulled his emergency kit from the truck, a habit left over from his firefighting days that Sarah used to tease him about. "Nobody's dying today," he said with the quiet confidence of someone who'd pulled dozens of people from worse situations. "What's your name?" "Isabel," she managed, wincing as she tried to shift position. "Isabel Lopez." The name meant nothing to Conrad. He'd never met Richard Lopez personally, had never seen photos of the man's family in the corporate newsletters that occasionally made their way to the construction sites. The Lopez empire was vast enough that a bridge worker like Conrad operated in a completely different universe from the executives who made decisions about his employment. To him, Isabel was simply a young woman in a wedding dress who needed help, not the heir to a fortune that could buy and sell his entire neighborhood. Working carefully but efficiently, Conrad managed to clear enough broken glass to reach Isabel's trapped leg. The dashboard had shifted during the impact, creating a gap just wide enough for him to maneuver his jack, the same tool he used to level concrete forms, into position. It took 20 minutes of careful pressure and adjustment, during which Isabel drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling about a wedding she'd run from and choices she couldn't make. When Conrad finally freed her leg and lifted her from the wreckage, carrying her up the embankment to safety, He had no idea that he'd just rescued the daughter of the man who'd signed his termination papers. He didn't know that Isabel had been missing for months, that her family had hired private investigators across 3 states to find her, that her disappearance had been the source of constant headlines in the business journals that tracked the Lopez family's every move. All Conrad knew was that he'd saved a life, and for the first time in months he felt like the man he used to be before layoffs and divorce papers and single parenthood had worn him down to someone who counted pennies at the grocery store. As he wrapped Isabel in the emergency blanket from his truck and called 911 on his phone, Conrad had no way of knowing that this moment would change everything, not just for Isabel, but for him and his daughter Emma, in ways that would challenge everything he thought he knew about fairness, family, and the distance between different worlds. The ambulance sirens were already wailing in the distance when Isabel grabbed Conrad's hand with surprising strength, her eyes focusing on his face with an intensity that suggested she was trying to memorize his features. "Thank you," she whispered, and something in her voice suggested she meant more than just the rescue, as if he'd saved her from something much larger than a car accident. Conrad squeezed her hand gently, thinking this would be the last time he'd see this brave young woman who'd survived something that could have killed her. He was wrong about that, just as he was wrong about almost everything else that was about to unfold in the most unexpected way possible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 6 months before that fateful morning on Riverside Highway, Isabel Lopez had stood in the ballroom of the Grandview Country Club, surrounded by 300 guests celebrating her engagement to Harrison Westfield III, and realized with crystal clarity that she was about to spend the rest of her life pretending to be someone she wasn't. The moment of truth came when Harrison casually mentioned to the mayor's wife that Isabel would be stepping down from her position at the Millbrook Environmental Foundation after their wedding, since married women shouldn't worry their pretty heads about saving trees when there are charity galas to organize. Isabel had spent 4 years building the foundation from a small nonprofit into the most effective environmental advocacy group in the tri-state area. She'd personally secured federal protection for over 10,000 acres of wetlands, had lobbied successfully for stricter industrial pollution standards, and had created job training programs that helped displaced coal miners transition to renewable energy careers. The foundation wasn't just her job, it was her calling, her proof that the Lopez family fortune could be used for something beyond accumulating more wealth and political influence. But according to Harrison and her father's carefully orchestrated plan for her future, none of that mattered anymore. Isabel Lopez was meant to be a wife, a hostess, and eventually a mother who would produce the next generation of Westfield Lopez heirs. Her environmental work was being dismissed as a phase she'd grown out of once she embraced her true responsibilities as a wealthy man's wife. The engagement party had been planned for over a year, every detail coordinated between her mother and Harrison's mother, like a merger between 2 corporations. The guest list read like a who's who of East Coast political and business elite. The 15-piece orchestra had performed for European royalty, the flowers had been flown in from Ecuador, and the champagne had been aging in French caves since before Isabel was born. Everything was perfect, elegant, and absolutely suffocating. Isabel had tried to smile through the endless parade of congratulations from people who knew her only as Richard Lopez's daughter, not as the woman who'd fought oil companies in federal court or who'd spent last Christmas serving dinner at a homeless shelter instead of attending the traditional Lopez family ski trip to Aspen. These people saw her as Harrison's beautiful acquisition, proof of his family's continued social relevance and political connections. Harrison Westfield III came from old New England money, the kind of family whose ancestors had owned shipping companies and textile mills, whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. At 35, he was considered one of the most eligible bachelors on the Eastern Seaboard. Handsome, educated, politically connected, and completely devoid of any genuine interest in Isabel as an individual. Their relationship had been arranged by their families when Isabel turned 25, the appropriate age for a Lopez daughter to begin seriously considering marriage. For 3 years, Isabel had tried to convince herself that fondness could grow into love, that shared social background could substitute for genuine compatibility. Harrison was polite, well-mannered, and never openly cruel. He simply saw her as a beautiful, well-bred woman, whose primary function was to enhance his political aspirations and social standing. When he looked at her, he saw the perfect senator's wife. not the passionate environmentalist who'd once chained herself to construction equipment to stop an illegal logging operation. The breaking point came during Harrison's speech to the assembled guests, when he joked about how he'd, quote, tame Isabel's wild environmentalist streak and redirect her energy toward more appropriate charitable work, like organizing fundraisers for the Symphony and Art Museum. The crowd laughed appreciatively, and Isabel felt something fundamental crack inside her chest. Not her heart breaking, but her spirit finally breaking free from the golden cage that had been constructed around her since childhood. She excused herself from the party, claiming she needed to powder her nose, and instead walked straight out of the country club and into the night. For the first time in her life, Isabel Lopez made a decision based purely on what she wanted rather than what was expected of her. She got into her car, a modest Honda Civic she'd bought with her foundation salary, not one of the luxury vehicles her father's money could have provided, and started driving with no destination in mind. The 6 months that followed had been the most terrifying and liberating of Isabel's life. She'd rented a small apartment in Riverside, a working-class town 40 miles from the Lopez estate, using her middle name and her mother's maiden name to avoid detection. She'd taken a job as a research assistant at a small environmental consulting firm, earning a fraction of what she'd made at the foundation, but relishing the anonymity and the chance to do meaningful work without the Lopez name opening doors or creating expectations. Isabel had learned to budget for groceries, to do her own laundry, to fix leaky faucets and unclogged drains. She'd made friends with her neighbors, a retired teacher, a single mother working 2 jobs, a veteran struggling with PTSD, people who valued her for her kindness and competence, not her family connections. For the first time in her life, she'd experienced genuine independence, the freedom to make choices based on her own values and desires. But freedom came with a price. Isabel knew her family was searching for her, that private investigators were tracking credit card records and employment databases. She'd seen her photo on missing person websites, had watched the news reports describing her disappearance as either a kidnapping or a mental breakdown. The stress of constantly looking over her shoulder, of living under an assumed identity, was exhausting. She couldn't maintain relationships because she couldn't tell anyone the truth about who she was. She couldn't pursue her environmental work openly because the Lopez name would give her away immediately. The wedding dress she'd been wearing during the accident was part of her plan to end the charade. Isabel had finally decided to return home, to face her family and Harrison, to formally break the engagement and demand the right to live her own life. She'd worn the dress, her grandmother's vintage Vera Wang that had been carefully preserved for this moment, as a symbol of everything she was rejecting. She was driving to the Lopez estate to have the confrontation she'd been avoiding for 6 months, to finally stand up for herself regardless of the consequences. She'd never made it to that confrontation. Instead, she'd fallen asleep at the wheel after driving all night, her car spinning off Riverside Highway in the pre-dawn darkness. When she'd woken up trapped in twisted metal, Isabel had thought she was going to die, wearing the symbol of everything that had made her feel dead inside. The irony wasn't lost on her, that she might end her life in the very dress that represented the life she'd been trying to escape. That's why Conrad Miller's voice, calling through the broken glass, had sounded like salvation itself. Isabel had been saved from the wreckage by a man who had no idea who she was, who'd risked his own safety simply because he couldn't ignore someone in need. For the first time in months, someone had helped her without expecting anything in return, without knowing her net worth or her family connections. Conrad had saved her life because it was the right thing to do, not because she was Richard Lopez's daughter. As the ambulance carried her away from the accident scene, Isabel Lopez made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to return to her old life quietly. She wasn't going to let this second chance be wasted on meeting other people's expectations. And somehow she was going to find a way to thank the man who'd given her the courage to finally fight for the life she actually wanted to live. Conrad Miller had learned to measure his life in 18-month intervals, the average time between layoffs in the construction industry. At 34, he'd worked for 7 different companies, each one promising stability, right up until the moment they handed him a pink slip and a handshake that meant nothing. But the pattern had started long before his construction career, back when he was Staff Sergeant Miller in the Army Corps of Engineers, building bridges and roads in places where people shot at you for trying to help them. The military had given Conrad structure, purpose, and Salens, a medic from Ohio who'd volunteered for 3 tours because she believed in making a difference. They'd met during a supply run outside Kandahar, where Sarah had been treating local children injured by roadside bombs. Conrad had been part of the engineering team, rebuilding a school that had been destroyed in the crossfire between Taliban fighters and coalition forces. He'd watched Sarah work with those kids, speaking to them in broken Pashto while cleaning wounds and distributing candy she'd bought with her own money, and he'd known immediately that he wanted to spend his life with someone who saw hope in hopeless situations. They'd married during a brief leave in Germany, exchanging vows in a small chapel on the military base with 2 fellow soldiers as witnesses. Sarah had worn her dress uniform instead of a wedding gown, and Conrad had never seen anything more beautiful. They'd planned to start a family after their tours ended, to buy a house somewhere quiet where Conrad could build things that wouldn't get blown up, and Sarah could work at a hospital where the patients weren't casualties of war. But plans meant nothing when an IED exploded under your convoy on what was supposed to be your last patrol before rotation home. Conrad had woken up in a military hospital in Landstuhl with 3 cracked ribs, a concussion, and the news that Sarah's vehicle had taken the brunt of the blast. She'd been killed instantly, the doctors assured him, as if that made the loss easier to bear somehow. The same hands that had saved countless lives had been stilled forever by a bomb planted by someone who'd probably never spoken to an American soldier, who'd seen Sarah and her medical team as enemies rather than healers. Conrad had come home to Sarah's parents' house in Millbrook Valley, carrying nothing but a purple heart he'd never asked for, and a grief so profound it felt like drowning in open air. Sarah's parents, Robert and Helen Castellanos, had been kind beyond measure, giving him a place to heal while he figured out what came next. Helen had been pregnant when they'd gotten the news about Sarah, and when Emma was born 6 months later, she'd become the unexpected center of Conrad's shattered world. Emma was Sarah's daughter in every way that mattered: the same dark hair, the same fierce independence, the same ability to make friends with broken things. Robert had died when Emma was 2, and Helen had followed 6 months later, victims of a car accident that left Conrad as Emma's sole guardian. At 28, he'd suddenly found himself responsible for a toddler who called him Daddy and had no memory of the parents who'd planned to raise her. The transition from soldier to single father had been brutal. Conrad knew how to build bridges and clear minefields, but he had no idea how to braid hair or negotiate with a 3-year-old who refused to eat anything that wasn't shaped like a dinosaur. He'd taken construction jobs because the skills translated well from military engineering, and the work was usually local, allowing him to be home when Emma got out of school. But construction work was feast or famine, dependent on weather, funding, and economic factors beyond any individual worker's control. Conrad had been laid off during the 2008 recession, during budget cuts in 2012, during the steel tariff crisis in 2018, and now again as Miller Development Corporation tightened its belt in response to declining government contracts. Each time he'd filed for unemployment, stretched his savings, and eventually found another job with another company that would inevitably let him go when profits demanded it. The current job with Miller Development had been different, though. The Riverside Bridge project was the biggest infrastructure investment in the region in 20 years, a federal contract that was supposed to provide steady work for at least 3 years. Conrad had allowed himself to hope that maybe this time would be different, that Emma could finish elementary school without having to worry about whether Daddy would be able to afford school supplies or birthday parties. Emma was 8 now, old enough to understand when Conrad sat her down to explain that Daddy's job was ending again, that they'd need to be careful with money until he found something new. She'd nod solemnly and promise to be good, as if his unemployment was somehow her fault, as if an 8-year-old's behavior could influence corporate budget decisions made in boardrooms she'd never see. Conrad had learned to hide his panic from Emma, to project confidence he didn't feel when she asked if they'd have to move again, if she'd have to change schools, if there would be money for the class trip to the science museum. He'd smile and assure her that Daddy always figured things out, that everything would be okay, while privately calculating how long his savings would last and whether he should start looking for work in other states. The irony of saving Isabel Lopez's life wasn't lost on Conrad once he learned who she was. 3 days before losing his job, he'd risked his own safety to rescue the daughter of the man who'd signed his termination papers. Richard Lopez probably made more money in an hour than Conrad earned in a year, yet Conrad had never hesitated to help Isabel, because that's what decent people did when someone was in trouble. Conrad had been raised by a grandfather who'd worked in the steel mills, who'd taught him that your worth as a man wasn't measured by your bank account or your job title, but by how you treated people who couldn't do anything for you in return. That lesson had been reinforced by his military service, where you judged people by their actions under pressure, not by their family background or college degrees. The rescue had felt good in a way that Conrad hadn't experienced in months. For 20 minutes, he'd been the person he used to be, competent, necessary, making a difference in someone's life. He'd forgotten about budget cuts and layoff notices, and the constant anxiety of never knowing if this paycheck would be his last. He'd simply been a man helping another human being, and that had felt like enough. Now, sitting in the hospital waiting room after giving his statement to the police, Conrad felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settling back on his shoulders. Tomorrow, he'd have to start job hunting again, updating his resume and making phone calls to contractors who might have work. He'd have to sit across from Emma at breakfast and pretend he wasn't worried about how they'd pay rent if he didn't find something quickly. But for the first time in months, Conrad also felt something else. A reminder of who he was when he wasn't worried about job security or financial stability. He was the kind of man who stopped to help strangers, who kept emergency equipment in his truck just in case, who'd spent 12 years as a volunteer firefighter because communities needed people willing to run toward danger instead of away from it. The hospital staff had told him that Isabel was going to be fine, that his quick thinking had probably saved her life. As Conrad finally headed home to relieve Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who watched Emma when his work schedule demanded early mornings, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Whatever happened with his job search, whatever challenges lay ahead, he'd done something that mattered today. That had to count for something in the grand scheme of things, even if it didn't pay the bills. Isabel Lopez had been raised in a world where every meal was a negotiation, every conversation was a performance, and every relationship was evaluated for its strategic value to the family empire. From the moment she could walk, she'd been groomed to represent the Lopez brand, a carefully crafted image of success, philanthropy, and social responsibility that masked the ruthless business practices that had built their fortune. The Lopez estate sprawled across 400 acres of prime Connecticut countryside, a monument to 4 generations of calculated ambition. Isabel's great-grandfather, Miguel Lopez, had arrived from Mexico in 1924 with nothing but a willingness to work construction jobs that paid half what white workers earned. By 1950, he'd saved enough to start his own small contracting business, focusing on projects other companies wouldn't touch. Dangerous demolition work, foundation repairs in flood zones, emergency construction after natural disasters. Miguel's son Carlos had expanded the business into commercial development, buying distressed properties during economic downturns and converting them into profitable ventures once markets recovered. He'd learned to navigate local politics, contributing to the right campaigns, and cultivating relationships with city planners and zoning officials. By the 1980s, Lopez Construction had become one of the largest development companies in New England, known for completing projects on time and under budget, regardless of the human cost to workers or environmental impact on surrounding communities. Richard Lopez, Isabel's father, had transformed the family business into a multinational corporation with interests in everything from luxury hotels to oil refineries. He'd graduated from Harvard Business School with the kind of connections that opened doors before you even knocked, and he'd used those relationships to secure government contracts, favorable regulations, and political protection for increasingly questionable business practices. The Lopez Foundation, ostensibly dedicated to education and environmental causes, served primarily as a tax shelter and public relations tool. Richard would donate modest amounts to highly visible charities while simultaneously lobbying against environmental regulations that might cost his companies millions in compliance expenses. He'd fund scholarships for underprivileged students while paying his own workers' wages so low they qualified for government assistance. Isabel had grown up watching this elaborate performance, taught from childhood that appearances mattered more than reality, that perception could be manufactured and sold like any other commodity. Her mother, Elena Lopez, had been a Spanish socialite whose family's old money pedigree provided the cultural sophistication Richard's nouveau riche fortune couldn't buy. Elena had transformed herself into the perfect billionaire's wife, beautiful, charming, and completely hollow, existing solely to enhance her husband's reputation at charity galas and political fundraisers. The Lopez children had been assets in this grand design. Isabel's older brother Ricardo had been groomed to take over the business empire, sent to the best schools, and trained in the art of profitable ruthlessness. Her younger sister Carmen had been positioned as the family's creative representative, her art gallery serving as a sophisticated money-laundering operation disguised as cultural patronage. Isabel had been designated as the family's conscience, the photogenic environmentalist whose activism would provide cover for her father's environmentally destructive business practices. Her education at Stanford, her law degree from Yale, her position at the Millbrook Environmental Foundation, all had been carefully orchestrated to create the illusion that the Lopez family genuinely cared about something beyond profit margins. But the plan had required Isabel to remain controllable, to limit her environmental work to symbolic gestures that wouldn't threaten the family's core business interests. When she'd started winning real victories, blocking pipeline projects, securing wilderness protections, lobbying for stricter pollution standards, Richard had grown increasingly concerned about his daughter's effectiveness. Her success was becoming a liability, drawing attention to the contradictions between the Lopez Foundation's stated mission and the family's actual practices. The engagement to Harrison Westfield III had been designed to solve this problem permanently. Harrison's family had deep roots in conservative politics, connections to oil companies, defense contractors, and other industries that would benefit from rolling back environmental regulations. As Harrison's wife, Isabel would be expected to abandon her activism and focus on more appropriate charitable work, hospital fundraisers, arts patronage, educational initiatives that didn't threaten corporate interests. Harrison himself had been perfectly suited for this role. Handsome, well-educated, and completely lacking in genuine convictions. He'd grown up in a world where marriages were business arrangements disguised as romantic partnerships. His previous relationships had been with women who understood the transactional nature of high society romance. Beautiful, accomplished women who'd trade their independence for social status and financial security. Isabel had tried desperately to fit into this predetermined role, to convince herself that she could maintain her environmental work while fulfilling her family's expectations. She'd attended the dinner parties where her father's business associates joked about tree huggers and environmental terrorists, smiling politely while they described activists like herself as naive idealists who didn't understand economic reality. She'd sat through planning sessions for her own wedding, watching her mother and Harrison's mother negotiate guest lists and seating arrangements like diplomats dividing territory after a war. The breaking point had come when Isabel discovered documents in her father's office detailing plans to use her marriage as leverage for a series of development projects that would destroy some of the same wetlands she'd worked to protect. Her environmental activism hadn't just been tolerated as harmless theater. It had been studied and cataloged so that her future husband could systematically dismantle her achievements once they were married. The discovery had been devastating, but not entirely surprising. Isabel had always known her family's wealth came from morally questionable sources, but she'd convinced herself that she could use her position to create positive change from within the system. Learning that her own activism had been weaponized against the causes she cared about had shattered that last illusion completely. Her disappearance 6 months ago had been an act of desperation disguised as rebellion. Isabel had known she couldn't simply break the engagement without facing consequences that would extend far beyond her personal life. The Lopez empire depended on carefully maintained relationships with political and business allies who expected certain outcomes from family alliances. Her rebellion wouldn't just anger her parents, it would potentially cost them millions in lost contracts and political access. But living under an assumed identity in Riverside had shown Isabel what authentic existence felt like. Working for an environmental consulting firm under the name Maria Castellanos, she'd experienced the satisfaction of solving problems through competence rather than connections. Her co-workers had valued her research skills and scientific knowledge, not her ability to open doors with a famous last name. For the first time in her life, Isabel had felt useful rather than ornamental. The decision to return home wearing her wedding dress had been symbolic, a final confrontation with everything the dress represented. Isabel had planned to walk into her father's office wearing the symbol of her surrender and formally declare her independence, regardless of the financial and social consequences. She had been prepared to be disowned, to lose access to the Lopez fortune, to start over completely with nothing but her education and determination. Instead, she'd ended up trapped in twisted metal on Riverside Highway, saved by a man who had no idea that helping her would cost him his job. The irony was cruel but perfect. Conrad Miller had risked his safety to rescue the daughter of the man who just destroyed his livelihood, and neither of them knew how their lives were already connected by forces beyond their control. Lying in her hospital bed, Isabel realized that her plan to confront her family had been naive. Simply rejecting their expectations wouldn't free her from their influence. It would only make her a more interesting target for their manipulation. If she wanted genuine independence, she'd need allies, resources, and a strategy more sophisticated than dramatic gestures. Isabel Lopez stared at the hospital ceiling for 3 hours after the doctors cleared her for discharge, knowing that the moment she walked out of this room, she would have to choose between two impossible futures. Her family's private investigators had already tracked her to Millbrook General Hospital. She'd seen the black town car with tinted windows in the visitor parking lot, the same vehicle that had been circling her Riverside apartment building for weeks before her accident. Her father's security team was waiting to escort her home to the estate, where she would face the consequences of 6 months of rebellion and the expectation that she would quietly resume her predetermined role as Harrison Westfield's grateful fiancé. The alternative was to disappear again, but this time with no resources, no false identity, and no plan beyond a desperate desire to avoid returning to her gilded cage. The consulting firm job was gone. Maria Castellanos had missed too many days of work and couldn't provide medical documentation without revealing her true identity. Her savings account under the assumed name contained barely enough money for a week's rent and groceries. Worst of all, her family now knew she was capable of vanishing, which meant any future escape attempts would be met with increased surveillance and security measures. But lying in that hospital bed, Isabel kept thinking about the man who'd pulled her from the wreckage. Conrad Miller hadn't asked about her family connections or her ability to compensate him for his heroism. He'd simply seen someone in need and acted, risking his own safety without calculating potential benefits or consequences. In a world where every relationship in Isabel's life had been transactional, Conrad's selfless intervention felt like a revelation, proof that genuine human decency still existed somewhere beyond the manipulative social circles she'd grown up in. When the discharge nurse brought her paperwork to sign, Isabel made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of calling her family or accepting the ride home that was undoubtedly being arranged, she asked to speak with Conrad Miller. The hospital staff initially resisted. Mr. Miller wasn't family, and hospital policy regarding patient privacy was strict. But Isabel had learned a few things about bureaucratic navigation during her months of living independently, and she convinced the charge nurse that Conrad was her emergency contact, the only person she trusted to ensure her safety. Conrad arrived at the hospital still wearing his work clothes, his hands stained with concrete dust and his expression cautious. He'd clearly been briefed by someone about Isabel's family background. His demeanor was respectful but distant, the way working-class people often behaved around wealth they couldn't comprehend or trust. Isabel realized that Conrad probably assumed she'd summoned him to offer some kind of reward for his heroism, a financial gesture that would allow both parties to feel good about the transaction and move on with their lives. "Mr. Miller," Isabel began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I know this is going to sound completely insane, but I need your help with something that has nothing to do with gratitude or money." Conrad's eyebrows rose slightly, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. Isabel appreciated his restraint. Most people in her social circle would have already begun offering suggestions or solutions before understanding the actual problem. "My family is waiting outside to take me home," she continued, "and if I go with them, I'll essentially be signing away any chance of living my own life. They're going to present this accident as evidence that I'm not capable of taking care of myself, that I need their protection and guidance. Within a week, I'll be back to planning a wedding to a man I don't love, preparing for a life that will make me miserable but will serve their business interests perfectly." Conrad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly wondering why she was sharing such personal information with a virtual stranger. "I'm not sure what you're asking me to do, Miss Lopez. Your family, they have resources I don't have. If you don't want to go home with them, there are lawyers, social services, other people better equipped to help you than a construction worker who's about to be unemployed." The mention of his job loss hit Isabel like a physical blow. She'd spent the morning researching Miller Development Corporation, learning about the Riverside Bridge project and the recent layoffs that had affected dozens of workers. Conrad Miller had saved her life on the same day he'd received notice that her father's company was terminating his employment. The cosmic unfairness of the situation was staggering. "Actually," Isabel said carefully, "that's exactly why I think you might be willing to help me. We've both been damaged by the same system, just in different ways. Your job, your financial security, your ability to provide for your daughter, all of that has been sacrificed so that my father's company can maintain profit margins that keep shareholders happy. Meanwhile, I've been treated like a valuable asset rather than a human being, expected to marry for strategic advantage rather than love." Conrad's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching understanding. "You're saying we're both victims of your father's business decisions." "I'm saying we're both people who've been told that our individual desires matter less than corporate interests," Isabel replied. "The difference is that you've been fighting for your family's survival while being honest about who you are. I've been living in luxury while pretending to be someone I'm not. But maybe together we could figure out a way to help each other." The proposal that came out of Isabel's mouth next was so audacious, so completely contrary to every social convention she'd been raised to follow, that she barely recognized her own voice speaking the words. She asked Conrad to let her come home with him, not as a romantic gesture or a cry for rescue, but as a temporary arrangement that would benefit both of them in practical ways. Isabel could contribute financially to his household, while she figured out her legal options for permanently severing ties with her family's control. She had access to trust funds that couldn't be frozen by her parents, money that could help Conrad weather his unemployment, and possibly start his own contracting business. In exchange, Conrad could provide her with something no amount of money could buy: the chance to experience authentic family life with people who valued honesty over appearances. "You want to live in my house," Conrad said slowly, "with me and my 8-year-old daughter, while you figure out how to divorce your family." "I want to learn how to be a normal person," Isabel corrected, "from someone who's managed to raise a happy, healthy child despite facing the kind of economic pressure that would crush most people. Emma is lucky to have a father who prioritizes her well-being over social expectations. Maybe you could teach me what that kind of authentic family relationship looks like." Conrad was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what she was proposing. Isabel could see him calculating risks and benefits, wondering if accepting help from Richard Lopez's daughter would create more problems than it solved. She understood his hesitation. Her family's wealth and influence could be as dangerous as it was potentially beneficial. "This isn't charity," Isabel added quickly. "This is a business arrangement between equals who happen to need different things from each other. You need financial stability while you look for work. I need time and space to make legal preparations for becoming financially independent from my family. We both need to prove that we can solve our problems without being rescued by people who want to control our choices." When Conrad finally nodded his agreement, Isabel felt something she'd never experienced before: the exhilaration of making a decision based purely on her own judgment, with full knowledge of the consequences, and no safety net beyond her own resources and determination. For the first time in her life, she was choosing her own path forward, even though she had no idea where it would lead. The choice would horrify her family and baffle Conrad's neighbors, but it felt more honest than any decision Isabel had ever made. She was placing her trust in a man who'd proven his character through actions rather than words, betting her future on the possibility that authentic relationships could be built on mutual respect rather than mutual advantage. Conrad's house on Maple Street was a modest 2-bedroom ranch that he'd bought with his VA loan 7 years ago, back when he'd still believed that homeownership represented stability rather than just another monthly payment that kept him awake at night during layoffs. The house needed work. The kitchen faucet leaked, the front steps sagged slightly, and the living room carpet showed years of wear from Emma's art projects and the succession of rescue animals she'd convinced him to foster over the years. But it was theirs, and walking through the front door with Isabel Lopez felt like crossing into an alternate universe, where billionaires' daughters learned to navigate the ordinary challenges of middle-class life. Emma had been skeptical about their unexpected houseguest until Isabel knelt down to her eye level and asked serious questions about the elaborate dollhouse Conrad had built from scrap lumber the previous Christmas. Within 10 minutes, Emma was giving Isabel a comprehensive tour of her room, explaining the organizational system she'd developed for her book collection and demonstrating the proper technique for feeding Rosie, the one-eyed tabby cat they'd adopted from the animal shelter 6 months earlier. "Daddy says you were in a car accident," Emma said with a matter-of-fact directness that 8-year-olds brought to difficult topics. "Mrs. Patterson next door broke her leg last year, and she had to use a walker for 3 months. Do you need a walker too?" Isabel smiled, charmed by Emma's practical concern. "No walker needed, but thank you for asking. I was very lucky that your dad found me when he did." "Daddy's good at helping people," Emma replied with absolute confidence. "He fixed Mr. Rodriguez's fence after the storm, and he taught Tommy's mom how to change a tire, and he always carries bandages in his truck in case someone gets hurt. Mrs. Patterson says Daddy has a hero complex, but I think he just likes making things better." Conrad felt heat rise in his cheeks as he listened to his daughter catalog his good deeds for Isabel's benefit. Emma had a tendency to present him as more noble than he actually was, seeing heroism in what he considered basic human decency. But watching Isabel's face as Emma spoke, he realized that his daughter's perspective might not be as naive as he'd assumed. To someone who'd grown up surrounded by people who calculated the cost-benefit ratio of every kind gesture, simple helpfulness probably did seem extraordinary. The first week of their arrangement established a routine that surprised everyone with its natural rhythm. Isabel proved unexpectedly useful around the house, approaching domestic tasks with the same methodical intelligence she'd applied to environmental research. She learned to operate the temperamental washing machine, mastered the art of grocery shopping with coupons and store sales, and discovered she had an aptitude for the kind of budget cooking that stretched a dollar without sacrificing nutrition. Conrad found himself teaching Isabel things he'd never realized he knew: how to recognize when the truck was due for an oil change by the sound of the engine, how to repair small appliances instead of replacing them, how to plan meals around what was on sale rather than what sounded appealing. Isabel absorbed these lessons with the focused attention of someone who'd never been required to understand the mechanics of daily survival. Emma appointed herself Isabel's guide to normal childhood experiences, sharing insights about everything from playground politics to the best techniques for convincing adults to extend bedtime on special occasions. Isabel learned to braid Emma's hair for school, to pack lunches that met the complicated requirements of 8-year-old taste preferences, and to navigate the social dynamics of elementary school pickup lines, where she was clearly an anomaly among the working parents and nannies. The neighbors on Maple Street had initially been suspicious of Isabel's presence, wondering what a woman who drove a BMW and wore designer clothes was doing in Conrad Miller's modest household. But Isabel's genuine interest in their lives and her willingness to help with community projects gradually won over even the most skeptical residents. She helped Mrs. Patterson organize her prescription medications, taught the Rodriguez children basic computer skills, and volunteered to coordinate the neighborhood's annual block party with the same efficiency she'd once applied to environmental campaigns. Most surprisingly, Isabel discovered she was gifted at the kind of practical problem-solving that Conrad's life required constantly. When the washing machine finally died completely, Isabel researched repair versus replacement costs, negotiated with appliance dealers, and arranged for installation while Conrad was out job hunting. When Emma needed a science fair project, Isabel helped her design an experiment, testing different water filtration methods, using materials from Conrad's workshop and her own environmental expertise. Conrad found himself seeing his own life through Isabel's eyes, noticing things he'd taken for granted or dismissed as temporary hardships. The way Emma automatically helped with dinner preparation because she understood that everyone in the family contributed to household functioning. The network of mutual support among neighbors who borrowed tools, shared babysitting duties, and looked out for each other's children. The satisfaction of fixing broken things instead of discarding them, of creating solutions with available resources rather than unlimited budgets. Isabel's presence also highlighted the financial stress that Conrad had learned to manage but never eliminated. Watching her calculate grocery expenses, research insurance options, and strategize about utility bills gave Conrad a new perspective on the constant mental load of economic uncertainty. Isabel approached these challenges like puzzles to be solved rather than sources of shame or anxiety, her analytical skills bringing fresh perspectives to problems Conrad had been managing through sheer determination. The transformation wasn't one-sided. Conrad found himself explaining not just practical skills but the values that guided his decisions. Why he'd chosen to stay in Millbrook Valley despite limited job opportunities. Why he prioritized Emma's stability over potentially lucrative positions that would require relocating. why he maintained his volunteer firefighter certification even though it meant less time for paid work. Isabel listened to these explanations with the intensity of someone learning a foreign language, gradually understanding that Conrad's choices reflected a completely different definition of success than anything she'd encountered in her previous life. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Isabel had learned to change the oil in Conrad's truck, to navigate the local food bank when money was particularly tight, and to recognize the signs that indicated Emma was worried about something but trying to protect the adults from her concerns. She'd also learned that happiness could exist in circumstances she'd previously considered impossible, that a family of 3 people and 1 elderly cat could create more genuine warmth than all the luxury and staff that had surrounded her childhood. The most profound discovery was that Isabel genuinely enjoyed the person she became in Conrad's household. Without the pressure to represent the Lopez family brand or fulfill social expectations, she found herself laughing more easily, speaking more honestly, and feeling useful in ways that had nothing to do with her trust fund balance or family connections. For the first time in her life, Isabel was valued for what she contributed rather than what she represented, and the difference was transformative. But even as Isabel adapted to her new environment, both she and Conrad knew that their arrangement existed in a bubble that couldn't last indefinitely. Her family's private investigators had been conducting discreet surveillance of Conrad's neighborhood, and Isabel's trust fund access would eventually be traced by forensic accountants. The question wasn't whether her past would catch up with them, but when, and whether the foundation they were building would be strong enough to survive the inevitable confrontation with forces determined to drag Isabel back into the life she'd rejected. The sanctuary Conrad's household provided Isabel extended far beyond the modest walls of the Maple Street house. For the first time in her adult life, Isabel woke up each morning without a predetermined schedule of obligations designed to serve someone else's agenda. No charity board meetings where her presence was required to validate the Lopez family's philanthropic reputation. No strategic lunches with political wives who saw her as a conduit to her father's influence. No carefully choreographed public appearances where every word was calculated for its potential impact on the family brand. Instead, Isabel's days began with Emma's gentle but insistent wake-up calls at 6:30 a.m., followed by the comfortable chaos of getting an 8-year-old ready for school while Conrad prepared for another day of job hunting. These morning routines had a rhythm that felt organic rather than imposed, built around genuine needs rather than social expectations. Isabel found herself looking forward to the simple pleasure of braiding Emma's hair, while listening to her chatter about upcoming spelling tests and playground drama that seemed monumentally important from an 8-year-old's perspective. After dropping Emma at Millbrook Elementary, Isabel would spend her mornings helping Conrad research job opportunities, draft applications, and prepare for interviews. She brought skills to this process that Conrad lacked: experience navigating corporate bureaucracies, familiarity with the kind of professional networking that could open doors, and access to industry connections through her environmental work. More importantly, she understood the psychological warfare of job searching in ways that Conrad, with his straightforward military background, sometimes missed. Isabel taught Conrad how to decode job postings that asked for cultural fit, code for discrimination against working-class backgrounds, and helped him craft responses that emphasized his leadership experience and problem-solving abilities, rather than just his technical skills. She researched company executives, identified mutual connections, and helped Conrad understand the unspoken rules of professional networking that could make the difference between getting an interview and having his application disappear into automated systems. The job search became a collaborative project that highlighted both their complementary skills and their shared frustration with economic systems that valued connections over competence. Isabel watched Conrad navigate rejection after rejection from companies that claimed they couldn't find qualified workers, while systematically excluding candidates who lacked 4-year degrees or corporate experience. The waste of human potential infuriated her in ways that her previous activist work had only touched intellectually. Afternoons brought different challenges and discoveries. While Conrad attended interviews or met with potential clients for freelance projects, Isabel would handle household logistics, grocery shopping with carefully planned lists and coupons, researching better deals on utilities and insurance, and managing the kind of financial optimization that middle-class families practiced out of necessity rather than choice. These experiences taught Isabel lessons no boarding school or university had provided. She learned that the difference between name brand and generic medications could represent a choice between Emma's school supplies and adequate health care. She discovered that timing grocery shopping around sales cycles could save enough money to cover unexpected car repairs. Most importantly, she began to understand that financial stress wasn't just about numbers on bank statements. It was about the constant mental energy required to optimize every decision, to live always conscious that a single emergency could destabilize everything you'd worked to build. Emma's presence transformed these educational experiences from abstract lessons into emotional realities. Isabel found herself genuinely invested in Emma's well-being in ways that had nothing to do with charity or obligation. When Emma mentioned that several classmates had signed up for summer art camp but that the fee was too expensive, Isabel felt a protective anger that surprised her with its intensity. This wasn't a child she was helping from a distance. This was a little girl whose happiness had become personally important to Isabel in ways she hadn't expected. The solution came through collaboration rather than charity. Isabel researched scholarship opportunities while Conrad investigated whether the art camp needed volunteer instructors who could teach construction-related skills like woodworking or basic engineering. Emma contributed by creating a portfolio of her artwork and practicing the interview skills that might be required for scholarship applications. The process took weeks of coordinated effort, but when Emma was accepted for a partial scholarship with Conrad providing supplementary instruction, the victory felt earned rather than purchased. These small triumphs created a sense of family unity that Isabel had never experienced, even during her childhood surrounded by luxury and privilege. The Lopez family had operated more like a corporation than a domestic unit, with each member playing assigned roles designed to advance collective interests. Genuine care and support had been secondary to maintaining appearances and achieving strategic objectives. Conrad's household operated according to completely different principles. Decisions were made based on what was best for Emma's development and the family's long-term stability, not what would look good to outside observers or advance anyone's career prospects. Love was expressed through practical support. Conrad teaching Emma to change a bicycle tire, Isabel helping with homework that challenged both of them, all three of them working together to maintain a household that belonged to everyone who lived there. The contrast became especially clear during Emma's school events, where Isabel observed the difference between authentic parental engagement and the performative involvement she'd witnessed in wealthy social circles. Conrad attended Emma's school concerts and art shows, not because he was expected to network with other parents or demonstrate his commitment to education, but because Emma's achievements genuinely mattered to him. He asked substantive questions about her projects, celebrated her progress without comparing her to other children, and provided the kind of unconditional support that allowed Emma to take creative risks without fear of disappointing the adults who cared about her. Isabel began to understand that Emma's confidence and curiosity weren't accidents. They were the natural result of growing up with a parent who valued her thoughts and feelings rather than just her achievements. Conrad listened to Emma's opinions about everything from dinner preferences to weekend activities, treating her perspective with respect, while maintaining appropriate boundaries. This balance between autonomy and guidance created an environment where Emma felt safe to express herself authentically, something Isabel had never experienced in her own childhood. The neighborhood community provided another dimension to Isabel's education in authentic relationships. Maple Street operated as an informal support network, where people helped each other not because of social obligations or charitable impulses, but because they understood that everyone benefited when the community functioned well. Mrs. Patterson shared vegetables from her garden not to demonstrate her generosity, but because fresh tomatoes were better when eaten immediately than when allowed to rot on the vine. Isabel found herself contributing to this network in ways that felt natural rather than calculated. Her environmental expertise helped neighbors understand energy efficiency improvements that could reduce utility costs. Her research skills assisted parents navigating special education services or medical insurance complications. Her access to professional connections occasionally opened doors for neighbors seeking employment or business opportunities. But the most valuable thing Isabel brought to Maple Street was something she'd never possessed before: the ability to form relationships based on genuine affection rather than strategic advantage. For the first time in her life, people sought her company because they enjoyed her conversation, not because they wanted access to her family's resources. Children from the neighborhood visited not because their parents were networking, but because Isabel had proven herself trustworthy and fun during impromptu games of kickball and art projects in Conrad's driveway. This sense of belonging created a foundation of security that allowed Isabel to begin processing the trauma of her previous life with clarity she'd never achieved before. Surrounded by people who valued authenticity over appearance, she could finally acknowledge how profoundly damaging her upbringing had been. Not because her family had been intentionally cruel, but because they had treated her as a valuable asset rather than a complete human being. The healing wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was real and sustainable. Each day brought small confirmations that she was capable of more than she'd been allowed to believe, that her instincts and preferences mattered, that she could contribute meaningfully to other people's lives without sacrificing her own identity in the process. The black Mercedes sedan appeared on Maple Street on a Tuesday morning, incongruously elegant among the pickup trucks and aging sedans that typically populated the working-class neighborhood. Isabel spotted it from Conrad's kitchen window while packing Emma's lunch, and her hands immediately began trembling as she recognized the vehicle from countless family events. The car belonged to Marcus Valdez, her father's head of security, a former Secret Service agent whose job involved solving problems that couldn't be handled through legal channels or public relations campaigns. Isabel had been expecting this moment for weeks, but the reality still hit her like ice water. The sanctuary she'd built on Maple Street had always been temporary, existing only as long as her family chose to respect her illusion of independence. Now that grace period was ending, and she could see through the tinted windows the silhouette of the man who'd been tasked with bringing Richard Lopez's wayward daughter back into compliance. The surveillance had been subtle but unmistakable for those who knew what to look for. Unmarked vans parked on side streets with clear sightlines to Conrad's house. Utility workers who seemed to spend excessive time near the telephone poles that provided the best observation angles. Delivery trucks that lingered longer than necessary while drivers consulted clipboards and made notes that had nothing to do with package distribution. Isabel had chosen not to share these observations with Conrad, partly to protect him from worry he couldn't address, but mostly because she'd hoped her family would eventually lose interest in her rebellion and allow her to fade into obscurity. That hope had been naive. The Lopez empire was built on control, and Richard Lopez couldn't afford to have his daughter living independently, making choices that might contradict the carefully constructed narrative about family values and unity that protected the company's public image. The knock on the front door came at exactly 8:15 a.m., timed to occur after Conrad had left for a job interview, but before Isabel would depart to volunteer at Emma's school library. Marcus Valdez stood on the front porch wearing an expensive suit that somehow made him look more threatening than if he'd been armed with obvious weapons. His presence transformed the modest neighborhood into a stage set for a confrontation that would determine whether Isabel's transformation had been real growth or merely an extended vacation from responsibility. "Miss Lopez," Marcus said with professional courtesy that couldn't disguise the implicit threat in his position, "your father requests your immediate return to the estate. There are urgent family matters that require your attention." Isabel had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times, but facing Marcus in person made her realize how much her confidence depended on the supportive environment Conrad's household provided. Standing alone in the doorway, she felt the familiar weight of family expectations pressing down on her like a physical force, reminding her of all the years she'd been trained to comply rather than resist. "I'm not returning to the estate, Marcus," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "I'm legally an adult, making my own choices about where to live and how to spend my time." Marcus's expression didn't change, but Isabel caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated he'd moved from routine persuasion to more serious pressure tactics. "Miss Lopez, your family is concerned about your mental health following the accident. Dr. Hartwell has prepared documentation supporting a temporary conservatorship that would ensure you receive appropriate medical supervision during your recovery period." The threat was elegantly constructed and utterly devastating. Dr. Hartwell was the family physician who'd been treating Lopez family members for 30 years, a man whose professional ethics had been gradually compromised by the generous donations the Lopez Foundation made to his research projects. A conservatorship would strip Isabel of legal authority over her own decisions, placing control of her finances, medical care, and living arrangements in her father's hands under the guise of protecting her from her own supposedly impaired judgment. Isabel understood immediately that this wasn't an empty threat. Her family had the legal resources to make a conservatorship appear reasonable to judges who might not look too closely at the motivations behind concerned relatives seeking to protect a young woman who'd been in a serious accident. The fact that she'd been living with a man she barely knew, using assumed names, and behaving in ways that contradicted her upbringing could all be presented as evidence of compromised mental capacity. But the threat also revealed something important about her family's strategy. They weren't trying to destroy her. They were trying to save her from herself, at least according to their worldview. Richard Lopez genuinely believed that Isabel's rebellion represented a temporary psychological crisis that could be resolved through appropriate intervention. He saw her environmental activism, her rejection of Harrison Westfield, and her current living situation as symptoms of a disorder that needed treatment rather than choices that deserved respect. This paternalistic concern was actually more dangerous than pure malice would have been. It meant that no amount of rational argument would convince her family to leave her alone, because they truly believed they were acting in her best interests. Richard Lopez had spent 30 years successfully controlling every aspect of his business empire through a combination of financial incentives and strategic pressure. Isabel's attempt to live independently represented a management problem that needed to be solved, not a daughter's legitimate desire for autonomy that deserved consideration. The conversation with Marcus lasted less than 10 minutes, but its implications stretched far beyond the immediate threat. Isabel realized that her family had been gathering intelligence about her new life for weeks, documenting her activities and relationships in ways that could be used to discredit her judgment or threaten the people she'd grown to care about. They knew about Conrad's unemployment, Emma's school schedule, and the financial support Isabel had been providing. Most disturbingly, they understood exactly how to weaponize her affection for her new family against her desire for independence. Marcus made this clear before leaving with a promise to return the following morning for Isabel's final decision. "Your father is aware of Mr. Miller's employment situation and his responsibility for his daughter's welfare. The Lopez Foundation has significant influence with local contractors and school district officials. Continued association with you could have unfortunate consequences for both Mr. Miller's career prospects and his daughter's educational opportunities." The threat was delivered with professional politeness, but its meaning was unmistakable. Isabel's family had the power to destroy Conrad's ability to find work in the construction industry, to create problems for Emma at school, to make life impossible for anyone who supported Isabel's independence. Her rebellion wasn't just risking her own future. It was endangering the people who'd shown her kindness and accepted her into their lives without expecting anything in return. After Marcus left, Isabel sat in Conrad's living room surrounded by the evidence of the life she'd built over the past month. Emma's artwork on the refrigerator, including a drawing labeled "My Family," that showed 3 stick figures and a cat standing in front of a small house. Conrad's job application spread across the kitchen table, annotated with Isabel's research about company backgrounds and interview strategies. The household budget they'd created together, documenting their shared commitment to making their unconventional arrangement sustainable. All of it could be destroyed by a single phone call from her father's office. Conrad would find himself blacklisted from construction jobs throughout the region. Emma would face subtle but persistent difficulties at school, and their modest but genuine happiness would be sacrificed to Richard Lopez's determination to reclaim control over his daughter's choices. Isabel understood that she was facing the real test of her transformation. Living with Conrad's family had been easier than she'd expected because it had required only positive changes, learning new skills, forming authentic relationships, discovering previously unknown aspects of her personality. But maintaining her independence would require sacrificing the safety and happiness of people she'd grown to love, forcing her to choose between her own freedom and their well-being. The cruel genius of her family's strategy was that it transformed her act of rebellion into an act of selfishness. If she continued to resist their expectations, she would prove that her commitment to independence mattered more to her than the welfare of an 8-year-old girl and a man who'd shown her unprecedented kindness. The Isabel Lopez who'd grown up in the estate's protective bubble might have seen this as a reasonable choice, but the woman who'd learned to braid Emma's hair and celebrate Conrad's small victories couldn't imagine prioritizing her own desires over their security. Conrad returned from his interview at Riverside Construction to find Isabel sitting at the kitchen table with documents spread before her like evidence in a trial she was conducting against herself. The job interview had gone well, better than well actually. The foreman had been impressed by Conrad's military background and his work on the bridge project, And there had been genuine enthusiasm about bringing him onto their team for a major hospital renovation that would provide steady work for at least 18 months. For the first time in weeks, Conrad had allowed himself to feel optimistic about their future. The salary would be enough to cover the mortgage and Emma's expenses, with some left over for the emergency fund he'd been trying to rebuild since his layoff. More importantly, the work would be meaningful, modernizing a children's hospital wing that served families throughout the valley. As he'd driven home, Conrad had been planning how to share the good news with Isabel and Emma, imagining the relief on both their faces when he could finally offer some stability after weeks of uncertainty. But one look at Isabel's expression told him that whatever optimism he'd gained during the interview was about to be tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. The documents on the table weren't job applications or household budgets. They were legal papers bearing the Lopez family crest, and Isabel's hands were shaking as she tried to organize them into some kind of comprehensible order. "We need to talk," Isabel said, and Conrad recognized the tone of someone about to deliver news that would change everything. He'd heard that same careful modulation in his commanding officer's voice before mission briefings that carried higher than usual risk of casualties. Isabel's explanation of her family's ultimatum was delivered with the clinical precision of someone who'd spent the day analyzing a problem from every possible angle. She outlined the conservatorship threat, the implicit dangers to Conrad's employment prospects, the potential consequences for Emma's school experience. She presented each element of her family's strategy with the same methodical thoroughness she'd once applied to environmental impact studies, as if comprehensive analysis could somehow minimize the devastating implications of their situation. Conrad listened without interruption, his military training helping him process tactical information even when the personal stakes made him want to react emotionally. He understood immediately that the Lopez family wasn't making empty threats. They had the resources and connections to follow through on every consequence they'd outlined. A word from Richard Lopez to the right people could ensure that Conrad never worked construction in the region again, that Emma faced subtle but persistent discrimination at school, that their quiet life on Maple Street became impossible to maintain. But Conrad also understood something that Isabel's analysis hadn't quite captured. The choice her family was offering wasn't really a choice at all. They were betting that Isabel's affection for Conrad and Emma would override her commitment to independence, that she would sacrifice her own autonomy to protect the people she'd grown to care about. It was emotional blackmail disguised as reasonable family concern, and it revealed exactly how little the Lopez family understood about the woman Isabel had become. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," Conrad said when Isabel finished her presentation. "Your family wants you to choose between your freedom and our safety. They're assuming that you'll prioritize our well-being over your own independence, because that's what a good, caring person would do." Isabel nodded, surprised by Conrad's calm response to information that should have triggered panic or anger. "Marcus will be back tomorrow morning for my decision. If I don't return to the estate voluntarily, they'll begin implementing consequences immediately. You'll start getting calls from contractors who suddenly don't have openings for someone with your qualifications. Emma's teachers will begin reporting concerns about her home environment. The pressure will increase gradually until continuing to support my rebellion becomes impossible." Conrad stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the neighborhood where he'd built a life for himself and Emma after Sarah's death. The houses were modest but well-maintained, occupied by families who understood that security came through mutual support rather than individual accumulation of wealth. It was a good place to raise a child, a community where people valued character over connections and measured success by different standards than the ones that governed Isabel's family. "You know what I think?" Conrad said, turning back to face Isabel. "I think your family is making a fundamental miscalculation about who you are and what you're capable of choosing." Isabel's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm not sure I follow. They're assuming that you'll sacrifice your independence to protect Emma and me because they think that's what love looks like. Making yourself smaller so that other people can be safe," Conrad explained. "But that's not love, Isabel. That's the same pattern of control they've been using to manipulate you your entire life, just dressed up as selfless concern for others." The observation hit Isabel like a revelation she'd been circling around without quite grasping. Her family's ultimatum wasn't just about reclaiming control over her choices. It was about reinforcing the fundamental lesson they'd been teaching her since childhood, that her individual desires mattered less than her obligation to protect and please other people. Even her rebellion was being reframed as selfishness that endangered innocent parties who depended on her consideration for their well-being. Real love, Conrad continued, means supporting someone's right to make their own choices, even when those choices create difficulties for the people who care about them. Emma and I don't need you to sacrifice your freedom to protect us. We need you to show us what it looks like when someone refuses to be controlled by threats and manipulation. Isabel felt tears she hadn't expected burning behind her eyes. But if I don't go back, they'll destroy your career prospects. Emma could face problems at school. You'll both pay the price for my stubbornness. Maybe, Conrad acknowledged. But if you do go back, what lesson does that teach Emma about how women should respond when powerful people try to control their choices? What does it teach her about standing up for herself when someone threatens the people she cares about? Do you want her to learn that the right response to bullying is surrender, as long as the bullying is sophisticated enough and comes from people with enough money to make their threats credible? The question reframed Isabel's dilemma in ways she hadn't considered. She'd been so focused on protecting Conrad and Emma from immediate consequences that she hadn't thought about the long-term implications of demonstrating that threats could successfully override personal autonomy. Emma was watching how the adults in her life responded to pressure, learning lessons about courage and compromise that would shape her own responses to future challenges. Conrad moved to sit beside Isabel at the table, his presence steady and reassuring without being overwhelming. "I've been thinking about that job interview I went to today," he said. "Good company, solid work, decent pay. But you know what I realized driving home? If I take that job knowing that your family has the power to destroy it whenever they choose, then I'm not really employed. I'm just temporarily useful to people who can withdraw their approval at any time." Hearers. Isabel understood immediately what he meant. The Lopez family's threats didn't just endanger Conrad's current prospects. They revealed the fragility of any security that depended on their continued tolerance. As long as Isabel remained in their sphere of influence, anyone who supported her independence would be vulnerable to retaliation that could be implemented through phone calls and strategic conversations rather than obvious aggression. "So what are you suggesting?" Isabel asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I'm suggesting that we stop trying to solve this problem by making you small enough to fit back into the cage your family built for you," Conrad replied. "I'm suggesting that we figure out how to build something strong enough to survive their attempts to destroy it, instead of hoping they'll choose not to attack if we're sufficiently compliant." The proposal was audacious and terrifying, requiring them to bet their future security on their ability to outmaneuver people with vastly superior resources and decades of experience in acquiring and maintaining control. But it was also the first strategy that treated Isabel as a partner rather than a problem to be managed, the first approach that assumed her independence was worth defending rather than a luxury that could be sacrificed when circumstances became difficult. For the first time since Marcus Valdez had appeared on Maple Street, Isabel felt something other than despair about her situation. Conrad wasn't trying to rescue her from her family's pressure. He was offering to stand beside her while she fought back, to help her find ways to protect the relationship without surrendering the autonomy that had made their connection possible in the first place. The choice was still impossible, but it was no longer about choosing between her freedom and their safety. It was about choosing between two different definitions of what safety actually meant and what kind of foundation they wanted to build their future on. The decision to fight back rather than surrender required Isabel and Conrad to acknowledge a painful truth. Their month together had been built on borrowed time and borrowed safety. The sanctuary of Maple Street had existed only because Isabel's family had chosen to allow it, and any sustainable future would need to be constructed on foundations that couldn't be destroyed by a few strategic phone calls from Richard Lopez's office. This meant Isabel would need to sever her financial dependence on her family completely, while Conrad would need to build career security that didn't rely on the goodwill of employers who could be influenced by Lopez family pressure. The separation wasn't dramatic or angry. It was a tactical necessity that both of them understood intellectually, even as it tore at the emotional bonds they'd been building. Isabel couldn't continue living in Conrad's house while her presence made him and Emma targets for her family's retaliation. Conrad couldn't provide the kind of support Isabel needed while he was focused on protecting his daughter from consequences he couldn't control. They needed to solve their individual problems independently before they could determine whether their relationship could survive in the real world beyond the protective bubble they'd created. Isabel's first step was finding legal representation that couldn't be compromised by her family's influence. This proved more challenging than she'd anticipated. The Lopez family's legal and business connections extended throughout the region, and most attorneys either had existing relationships with Lopez Enterprises or couldn't afford to antagonize such a powerful potential adversary. Isabel eventually found help through the environmental advocacy network she'd built during her years at the foundation, connecting with Sarah Chen, a civil rights attorney who specialized in cases involving wealthy families who used their resources to control adult children. Halt. Sarah's office was located in a converted warehouse in the arts district of downtown Millbrook, furnished with second-hand furniture and decorated with framed newspaper clippings documenting her victories against corporate polluters and discriminatory employers. The contrast with the mahogany-paneled law firms that typically serve the Lopez family was intentional and reassuring. This was clearly a lawyer who measured success by impact rather than billable hours. Conservatorship cases involving wealthy families are more common than people realize, Sarah explained during their initial consultation. Adult children who want to pursue careers their parents disapprove of, who marry outside their social class, who choose lifestyles that conflict with family business interests. The legal system is supposed to protect individual autonomy, but money can purchase very compelling expert testimony about mental incapacity and family concern. The strategy Sarah outlined was comprehensive and expensive, requiring Isabel to document her mental competency through independent psychological evaluation, establish her financial independence through legitimate employment, and create a paper trail demonstrating rational decision-making over time. Most importantly, Isabel would need to prove that her choices, however unconventional, were the result of thoughtful consideration rather than impaired judgment or external manipulation. This process required Isabel to confront aspects of her situation she'd been avoiding. She needed legitimate employment under her real name, which meant potential employers would inevitably discover her family background and make assumptions about her motivations and qualifications. She needed to access her trust funds in ways that couldn't be blocked by her parents, which required navigating complex financial instruments designed to prevent exactly the kind of independence she was seeking. Most challenging, Isabel needed to rebuild her professional reputation outside the shadow of her family's influence. Her environmental work had always been enhanced by the Lopez name. Doors opened, meetings were granted, and projects received funding because people wanted to maintain relationships with her father's business empire. Proving her competence without those advantages meant starting over in ways that were both humbling and liberating. Conrad faced equally complex challenges in building security that couldn't be destroyed by external pressure. The construction industry in Millbrook Valley was small and interconnected, with most major projects involving companies that had business relationships with Lopez Enterprises. Taking a traditional employment position would always leave him vulnerable to the kind of professional sabotage Marcus Valdez had threatened. The solution Conrad developed drew on skills he'd learned during his military service and refined through years of managing Emma's needs as a single parent. He decided to start his own contracting business, focusing on projects too small for major companies but too complex for general handymen. Home renovations, small commercial improvements, specialized repairs that required both technical expertise and careful project management. Starting the business required Conrad to leverage every relationship he'd built during his years in the valley. Mrs. Patterson became his first client, hiring him to convert her basement into an apartment for her elderly mother. The Rodriguez family needed bathroom modifications to accommodate their son's disability. Emma's teacher mentioned that her brother was looking for someone to renovate a rental property he'd inherited. Word spread through the networks of mutual support that sustained working-class communities, generating referrals based on reputation rather than corporate connections. The work was demanding and uncertain, requiring Conrad to function as contractor, project manager, bookkeeper, and marketing department simultaneously. Some days he earned more than he'd made at Miller Development. Other days, he spent more on materials and gas than he collected in payments. But the income was his own, generated through relationships he'd built personally rather than employment that could be terminated by people he'd never met. The separation also forced both Isabel and Conrad to confront how much their individual growth had depended on their relationship with each other. Isabel had learned to navigate practical challenges through Conrad's patient instruction, but she'd never been required to solve problems completely independently. Conrad had rediscovered optimism and purpose through Isabel's presence, but he needed to maintain that emotional stability without external validation. Emma, caught between two adults who were trying to protect her from consequences she didn't fully understand, provided the most honest assessment of their situation. "Why are you and Isabel pretending you don't miss each other?" she asked Conrad one evening as they worked together on her math homework. Mrs. Patterson says that sometimes grown-ups make things more complicated than they need to be because they're scared of being happy. The observation was devastating in its accuracy. Both Conrad and Isabel were allowing fear of future consequences to prevent them from acknowledging how much their separation was costing them emotionally. They were so focused on building independent security that they'd lost sight of what they were trying to protect. Not just their individual autonomy, but their connection to each other and the family they'd begun building together. 3 months into their separation, Isabel had secured employment with a regional environmental consulting firm, established her own bank accounts and credit lines, and successfully defended against her family's initial legal challenges. Conrad's contracting business was generating steady income and developing a reputation for quality work and fair pricing. Both had demonstrated their ability to function independently, despite the pressures designed to force them back into compliance with expectations they'd rejected. But independence without connection felt hollow in ways neither had anticipated. Isabel's apartment above an art gallery downtown was stylish and completely hers, but she missed the comfortable chaos of Conrad's house, the morning conversations with Emma, the sense of belonging to something larger than her individual ambitions. Conrad had achieved the financial stability he'd been seeking, but success felt incomplete without someone to share it with who understood what the achievement meant. The question was whether they could rebuild their relationship on the foundation of mutual independence they'd established, or whether the process of becoming self-sufficient had revealed incompatibilities that had been masked by their initial desperation and gratitude. Both had changed during their separation, grown stronger but also more guarded, more capable, but also more aware of how much they had to lose if they made the wrong choices about trust and vulnerability. The answer would require them to risk the security they'd worked so hard to achieve, betting that what they'd built together was strong enough to survive not just external pressure, but the internal changes that growth and independence had created in both of them. The phone call that changed everything came on a Thursday afternoon in October. 6 months after Isabel and Conrad had last spoken beyond polite exchanges during Emma's school events, where they'd maintained careful distance to avoid creating opportunities for her family's surveillance team. Isabel was reviewing environmental impact assessments for a proposed shopping complex when her assistant announced that Emma Miller was in the lobby, asking to speak with her about an urgent matter that couldn't wait for adult permission. Emma stood in the consulting firm's reception area wearing her school uniform and an expression of determined seriousness that reminded Isabel powerfully of Conrad during moments when he was solving problems that seemed impossible to everyone else. At 9 years old, Emma had grown taller and more confident during the months of separation, but she still possessed the same direct honesty that had made Isabel feel welcomed during those early days on Maple Street. "I need to hire you," Emma announced without preamble, producing a carefully folded piece of paper from her backpack. "Mrs. Patterson helped me write a business letter because Daddy doesn't know I'm here, and I didn't want to get in trouble for not following proper procedures." The letter was written in Emma's careful cursive handwriting on lined notebook paper, formally requesting Isabel's professional services as an environmental consultant for a project that Emma described as extremely important to my family's future happiness and also good for nature. Emma had managed to save $47 from her allowance and various odd jobs, which she solemnly presented as a retainer for Isabel's consulting services. Isabel found herself simultaneously charmed and concerned by Emma's initiative. "Emma, what kind of environmental project are you working on? And does your father know you're here?" "Daddy doesn't know because he's been sad for months and I don't think he knows how to fix it," Emma replied with the matter-of-fact directness that had always been her trademark. "But I figured out that he's sad because he misses you, and you're probably sad because you miss us. And maybe, if we had a business reason to work together again, the grown-ups could stop being so worried about protecting everyone from bad things that might happen." The project Emma outlined was ambitious beyond anything Isabel might have expected from a 9-year-old, but it also demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of both environmental science and human psychology. Emma wanted to convert a vacant lot next to Maple Street into a community garden that would provide fresh vegetables for neighborhood families while creating habitat for local wildlife. She'd researched soil testing procedures, identified native plants that would attract beneficial insects, and calculated the costs of basic infrastructure like raised beds and irrigation systems. More importantly, Emma had recognized that the project would require exactly the kind of collaboration between Isabel's environmental expertise and Conrad's construction skills that might provide a legitimate reason for them to work together without violating the careful boundaries they'd established. The community garden would be too complex for Emma to manage alone, too technical for neighborhood volunteers to complete without professional guidance, and too meaningful to ignore given the genuine need for fresh food access in their working-class community. Mrs. Patterson says that sometimes when grown-ups can't figure out how to solve their problems, kids have to help them remember what's actually important, Emma explained, producing additional papers from her backpack that documented her research into community garden best practices and local zoning requirements. I think what's important is that our family should be together and also that people shouldn't have to drive 20 minutes to buy vegetables that aren't expensive. Isabel spent an hour reviewing Emma's proposal, impressed despite herself by the thoroughness of the 9-year-old's planning and the sophistication of her approach to what was essentially a relationship intervention disguised as an environmental project. Emma had correctly identified that both Isabel and Conrad were avoiding contact, not because they'd stopped caring about each other, but because they were afraid that reconnecting would recreate the vulnerabilities that had made them targets for her family's manipulation. The community garden provided a solution that addressed both their personal and professional needs. Isabel could use the project to demonstrate her commitment to environmental work that served working-class communities, rather than just wealthy clients seeking regulatory compliance. Conrad could showcase his ability to manage complex construction projects while building relationships with potential customers for his contracting business. Most importantly, they could collaborate on something meaningful without having to acknowledge the emotional complexity of their separation or risk the security they'd each worked to establish. The first planning meeting took place in the conference room of Isabel's consulting firm, with Emma serving as the official client and both adults maintaining professional distance that fooled no one, least of all Emma herself. Conrad arrived with blueprints and cost estimates, Isabel brought soil analysis reports and plant selection recommendations, and Emma provided snacks she'd baked with Mrs. Patterson's help, along with a detailed agenda that covered everything from project timelines to conflict resolution procedures. "I think we should establish some ground rules," Emma announced, consulting notes she'd written on index cards. "First, this is a business meeting about helping our neighborhood, so everyone should focus on that instead of being weird about personal stuff. Second, if anyone starts acting sad or awkward, we should take a 5-minute break to remember that we're trying to build something good instead of worrying about things that might go wrong. Third, I get to approve all decisions because it's my project and I'm paying for it." The professional facade lasted approximately 15 minutes before Conrad and Isabel found themselves laughing at Emma's matter-of-fact management style and gradually relaxing into the comfortable collaboration that had characterized their best moments together. Working on concrete problems, soil composition, drainage systems, plant spacing, provided a safe context for rebuilding trust without having to address the emotional issues that had made their separation necessary. Over the following weeks, the community garden project became a catalyst for reconnection that extended far beyond the vacant lot on Maple Street. Neighbors who'd been watching Conrad and Isabel's separation with sympathetic concern began volunteering their time and expertise, creating a network of support that couldn't be disrupted by external pressure because it was based on shared community investment rather than individual relationships. Mrs. Patterson contributed her extensive knowledge of local growing conditions and heirloom varieties. The Rodriguez family provided labor and Spanish-language outreach to immigrant families who might benefit from garden plots. Emma's teacher helped coordinate school involvement, turning the garden into an outdoor classroom for environmental education. What had begun as Emma's scheme to reunite two adults she cared about evolved into a genuine community development project that served needs neither Isabel nor Conrad had fully recognized. The success of the garden project also demonstrated something important about the foundation they'd been building during their separation. Both had developed the professional competence and emotional stability necessary to collaborate as equals rather than as rescuer and rescued person. Isabel's environmental expertise was valuable because of her technical knowledge and practical experience, not because of her family connections. Conrad's construction skills and project management abilities were respected because of his demonstrated competence, not because anyone felt sorry for his circumstances. Most importantly, Their collaboration was sustainable because it was based on mutual benefit rather than emotional dependence. The garden project succeeded because both adults brought irreplaceable skills to challenges that neither could solve alone, creating a partnership that enhanced their individual capabilities rather than requiring them to sacrifice autonomy for security. By the time the first vegetables were harvested in late summer, it had become clear to everyone involved that the garden was just the beginning of a partnership that could encompass much more than environmental projects. Conrad's contracting business was thriving, partly because of referrals from clients who'd observed his work on the garden infrastructure. Isabel's consulting firm had developed a specialty in community-based environmental projects that served working-class clients who'd been ignored by larger firms. The question was no longer whether they could rebuild their relationship, but what form that relationship should take now that both had proven their ability to thrive independently. They were no longer the desperate people who'd found each other during moments of crisis. They were competent adults who'd chosen to work together because their collaboration created something more valuable than either could achieve alone. Emma, observing the adults' gradual recognition of what she'd understood from the beginning, allowed herself a satisfied smile as she updated her project notebook with harvest totals and plans for next year's expanded growing season. Sometimes, she reflected, grown-ups needed help remembering that the best solutions were usually the obvious ones they'd been too scared to try. 2 years after Emma's community garden intervention had reunited them, Isabel and Conrad stood in the conference room of Miller Environmental Solutions, the consulting firm they'd established together in downtown Millbrook, reviewing proposals for their most ambitious project yet. The Riverside Valley Restoration Initiative would transform 300 acres of abandoned industrial land into a sustainable mixed-use development featuring affordable housing, community spaces, and environmental remediation that would serve as a model for similar projects throughout the region. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that the project's primary funding was coming from the Lopez Foundation, channeled through intermediaries who allowed Richard Lopez to support his daughter's work without directly acknowledging the legitimacy of her choices. Isabel's relationship with her family had evolved into a careful détente based on mutual respect for boundaries and shared recognition that some forms of collaboration could benefit everyone involved, even when personal relationships remained complicated. The Foundation's Environmental Grants Program now provided significant funding for community-based projects throughout New England, guided by Isabel's expertise in identifying initiatives that created genuine environmental benefits while serving working-class communities that had been excluded from traditional conservation efforts. Richard Lopez had discovered that his daughter's authentic commitment to environmental justice provided his foundation with credibility that no amount of public relations spending could purchase, while Isabel had learned to leverage her family's resources without compromising her independence or values. Conrad's role in the partnership extended far beyond construction management, though his ability to complete complex projects on time and under budget remained crucial to their success. His military background and experience navigating economic uncertainty had made him an effective advocate for working-class communities who needed environmental improvements, but couldn't afford the premium prices typically charged by consulting firms serving wealthy clients. Conrad understood how to translate environmental science into practical solutions that busy families could implement without extensive education or significant financial investment. The business they'd built together specialized in projects that other firms avoided: contaminated sites in low-income neighborhoods, brownfield remediation in post-industrial communities, environmental justice cases involving corporate pollution that affected vulnerable populations. Their willingness to take on challenging projects had generated both steady income and a reputation for effectiveness that attracted clients throughout the region. Emma, now 11 years old and serving as the unofficial photographer and social media coordinator for Miller Environmental Solutions, had developed into a sophisticated environmental advocate in her own right. Her school science fair projects focused on water quality monitoring and urban wildlife habitat preservation. She maintained detailed documentation of the community garden's evolution from vacant lot to thriving neighborhood center, creating before and after photo sequences that demonstrated the tangible impact of environmental restoration work. More importantly, Emma had grown up watching two adults build a relationship based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than traditional romantic scripts or economic necessity. She understood that Conrad and Isabel's partnership worked because both were complete individuals who chose to collaborate rather than incomplete people who needed each other to feel whole. This foundation provided Emma with a model of healthy relationships that would serve her well as she navigated her own future partnerships and friendships. The family they'd created together defied conventional categories in ways that had initially confused their neighbors but eventually earned widespread respect and acceptance. Conrad and Isabel maintained separate apartments but spent most evenings together at the house on Maple Street, sharing meals and homework assistance and the daily responsibilities of raising Emma. They attended school events together, planned vacations as a family unit, and presented themselves to the world as a committed partnership without requiring legal documentation or social validation of their arrangement. Their relationship had been tested by challenges that would have destroyed connections based on less solid foundations. When Isabel's family had attempted to use tax audits and regulatory investigations to pressure her into returning to their sphere of influence, Conrad had provided both emotional support and practical assistance without trying to solve her problems for her. When Conrad had faced medical bills following a construction accident that threatened to bankrupt his business, Isabel had provided financial resources without making him feel diminished or dependent. Most significantly, they'd learned to support each other's individual growth rather than trying to maintain static roles that felt safe but limited their potential for development. Isabel had completed graduate coursework in environmental engineering, expanding her technical expertise beyond the policy and advocacy skills she'd developed during her early career. Conrad had obtained project management certification and developed specialties in sustainable construction techniques that made him one of the region's most sought-after contractors for green building projects. The Riverside Valley project represented the culmination of everything they'd learned about collaboration, community development, and environmental restoration. The initiative would create affordable housing for 200 families while remediating soil and water contamination from decades of industrial activity. Native plant restoration would provide habitat for wildlife while creating recreational opportunities for residents who'd been excluded from traditional conservation areas. Job training programs would teach local residents the skills needed for ongoing maintenance and expansion of sustainable infrastructure. But beyond its environmental and social benefits, the project demonstrated the effectiveness of the partnership Conrad and Isabel had spent years developing. Neither could have conceived or implemented such an ambitious initiative alone. It required Isabel's technical expertise and policy knowledge combined with Conrad's practical construction experience and community relationships. Their collaboration had evolved to the point where their individual contributions enhanced each other seamlessly, creating outcomes that exceeded what either could achieve independently. The project's success also validated the unconventional approach they'd taken to building their relationship and family. Emma's suggestion that they focus on shared work rather than romantic declarations had led them to discover that the strongest partnerships were built on mutual respect and complementary skills rather than emotional dependence or social expectations. Their love for each other had grown from genuine appreciation of each other's character and capabilities, creating a foundation that could support both individual autonomy and collective commitment. As they finalized the contracts that would launch the Riverside Valley Initiative, Isabel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The frightened woman who'd been trapped in a wedding dress in a predetermined life had been replaced by someone who could navigate complex environmental challenges while maintaining relationships based on honesty rather than obligation. The rescue that had seemed like the end of her old life had actually been the beginning of discovering who she could become when she stopped trying to meet other people's expectations and started pursuing work that matched her values and capabilities. Conrad's transformation had been equally profound, though perhaps less dramatic from the outside. The unemployed construction worker who'd pulled a stranger from a car wreck had evolved into a successful business owner whose work created lasting positive impact in his community. More importantly, he'd learned that providing for Emma's needs didn't require him to sacrifice his own growth or accept employment that compromised his integrity. The security he'd been seeking through traditional employment had come instead through building something of his own that aligned with his values and served people he cared about. The community garden that had started their reunion had expanded to encompass 6 vacant lots throughout Millbrook, managed by neighborhood volunteers who'd learned to see environmental stewardship as both personal responsibility and collective opportunity. The success of these smaller projects had generated political support for larger initiatives like the Riverside Valley development, creating a model that other communities were beginning to replicate. Emma's role in all of this had evolved from matchmaker to environmental advocate to junior business partner who contributed genuine value to their projects. Her photography documented their work in ways that helped other communities visualize possibilities for their own development. Her social media posts attracted volunteers and funding from sources that traditional marketing approaches couldn't reach. Most importantly, her perspective reminded the adults that environmental work was ultimately about creating a world where children could thrive, not just about solving technical problems or generating income. The evening after signing the Riverside Valley contracts, the three of them sat on the front porch of the Maple Street house, watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk while reviewing the day's accomplishments and planning tomorrow's work. The routine had become as comfortable and sustainable as the relationship they'd built together, purposeful without being rigid, affectionate without being possessive, ambitious without losing sight of what they were trying to protect and nurture. Isabel had never returned to her family's estate as a permanent resident, but she'd maintained relationships that allowed her to influence the Lopez Foundation's giving while preserving her independence. Conrad had never taken another traditional employment position, but his business had grown to include 3 full-time employees and partnerships with environmental firms throughout New England. Emma had never doubted that she was loved and valued by 2 adults who'd chosen to build their lives around what mattered most to all of them. The fire that had destroyed Isabel's predetermined life had cleared ground for something none of them could have imagined. A family built on choice rather than obligation, work that served communities rather than just individual advancement, and love that strengthened rather than diminished the people it connected. Sometimes the best thing that could happen to a carefully constructed life was for it to burn down completely, creating space for something authentic to grow in its place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.